Thank you, General Newton. It's a pleasure to be back at the Royal United Services Institute. I was here in February where I gave an address on urban warfare and historical context. And what I'm going to do today is talk about 8 future capabilities that I think land forces must have in order to outmaneuver their enemies. And I'll start with the urban, because land forces in the future must be able to operate in an urban environment as well as in rural areas. The world is increasingly urbanized. Fallujah, Mosul, and Raqqa, only our 3 most recent urban battles, are not an outlier, but they are part of a trend stretching back into the 20th century and which will continue into the 21st. And this is because opposing forces will position themselves in urban areas, both to control and take advantage of the population, and also in an attempt to negate the advantage of guided munitions, which are less effective in those environments. The second important capability is the ability to operate in a hybrid environment. Hybrid warfare, that is the deliberate melding of conventional and irregular forces to achieve a common outcome, is with us to stay. And land forces must be designed and trained to operate in this context. I have co-edited a book with Dr. Williamson Murray on this. It's called Hybrid Warfare, creatively titled. Came out from Cambridge University Press in 2013, and I commend it for those who want a historical look at hybrid warfare. It has been and will continue to be the most difficult form of warfare. And that is because you're fighting not only against a known enemy to the front, but against irregular forces throughout the breadth and depth of the battle space. And it is maneuver in 4 dimensions with the information component as well, especially given the irregular forces which use that component of warfare so handily. And I would ask this question for land force commanders in the audience. Who in your headquarters is monitoring the enemy's Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram feeds? Because they are using those programs as part of the battle space. And if you aren't also on that field, then you cede the field of battle to them. The third important aspect is, as the physical environment becomes more deadly, robotic systems will become more important, especially as they mature. And they will first be used as adjuncts to manned systems. This is both to reduce the risk of casualties, and also you can take more risk with robotic systems than you can with manned systems. And so they enable maneuver. And now there are significant ethical considerations, I think, that are in play here, especially with autonomous robotic systems, and that's something that has to be considered as we move forward into the future. And the public will have something to say about this as well as they already have. The fourth aspect is armed forces must be able to operate in an alliance context. Now, I would say that the United States Armed Forces have the furthest to come in this regard. We're used to basically being the biggest dog on the block and operating alone and forcing everyone to fall in line with us, and that will increasingly not be the case in the 21st century. I just go back to a vignette from my time as a brigade commander in Karbala in Iraq in 2004, when my brigade was deployed from Baghdad to Karbala in order to reclaim the city from the Jaysh al-Mahdi. A Polish brigade was stationed there. It had a Polish battalion, 2 Polish battalions, and a Bulgarian battalion. And their rules of engagement would not allow them to conduct offensive operations, thus our presence down there. And I was wondering, well, how are we going to be able to operate with this Polish-Bulgarian hybrid unit? And the answer became pretty simple once I learned who was on the ground, because the Chief of Staff, Executive Officer of the brigade, was a U.S. Army War College graduate. And when they held their first staff conference, it was in English, and they used NATO procedures. And so NATO became the glue that held that whole operation together even though it was not a NATO operation and it was being conducted in the Middle East. And this is the sort of thing that we all need to think about going into the future. The fifth capability is we must have the ability to operate in an environment where air and cyberspace are contested. The last time that US forces and British forces as well operated in a contested airspace environment was North Africa in 1942. The German General Staff had this to say about Allied air superiority in World War II, that without control of the air, maneuver is impossible. And Dwight Eisenhower, in his memoir of the war, Crusade in Europe, wrote that increasingly this will be land-air battle, which has since been reversed to air-land battle, and now air-land cyberspace battle. This has a lot of implications for land forces. I think one of them is we must be able to operate in a degraded mode if satellite links, and with them, the GPS and communications that we rely on in the present, are disrupted. And that means that alternate means of command and control have to be built into military systems and not be an afterthought. The sixth capability is the ability to counter unmanned aerial systems. Guided munitions, as we know, are devastating to mass targets. Evolution of unmanned aerial systems are likely to follow the evolution of manned aviation. And I think in that regard, we are in the year 1916. Think about it. With manned aviation, you began World War I using planes as reconnaissance platforms, and then they figured out how to drop hand grenades and then eventually bombs from them for close air support and interdiction missions. And then you figured out how to do air-to-air combat, and the last step was the use of manned aviation systems as air transport. So what's going to come with unmanned aerial systems is the air-to-air combat and then the autonomous airlift. And that will be coming soon. Planes already can land themselves. The computer can do that. Air defense, that for the land forces, this means that air defense and missile defense and rocket defense and cyber defense will again be critical to maneuver in the future, and you cannot ignore your air defense branch any longer. The seventh aspect is that lines of communications and logistics chains are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to irregular forces, they're vulnerable to guided munitions, and land systems must reduce their dependence on them. This means better fuel efficiency or different types of fuel, increasing use of guided or directed energy munitions, which would mean less ammunition that has to be carried to the front line. And the final one, and one that I think has been ground to powder this morning, is the essential ability to operate in a pervasive information environment. Information operations are much more than an adjunct to maneuver, given the inability to limit information and its flow out of a theater of operations. I'm actually over here on a World War II tour. I'm guiding a tour of Ohio State alumni. So this is holiday, and I was called in from the bullpen here to speak. We're going to go up to Bletchley Park on Friday. Can you believe that the secret of Ultra was kept for 30 years and no one divulged it? That it was kept even during the war. Will that happen again? Doubtful. And the ability of soldiers and civilians to tweet or put things on Facebook, use social media, it's going to be very difficult to limit flow of information out of a theater of operations. And that means that information operations have to be part and parcel of the operation itself. It's what you plan for. And likewise, deception operations will likely be waged in cyberspace. I'll be talking about Fortitude North and Fortitude South, the excellent deception operations before D-Day, to my group. In the future, that is likely to be waged on the internet. And the bad point here, the bad news is that Russia is ahead of the West in this regard. The 21st century bodyguard of lies is going to be someone on the internet, a hacker, someone on social media, and the ability to manipulate those tools for mission accomplishment. and we have a long way to go in that regard as well. I'll end there. Hopefully I was within my allotted 10 minutes. Thank you very much.